Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Today we are diving into potential changes in German defense policy. Specifically, how things might change if Friedrich Merz becomes the next Chancellor of Germany.
Okay.
He's the leader of the Christian Democratic Union. And his approach to defense is, well, it's quite different from Angela Merkel's.
It is.
He seems much more focused on building up Germany's military strength, making it bigger and more powerful, and he wants to see Germany rely less on the United States for security.
He does.
This is a pretty significant shift because Germany has had a very particular way of thinking about defense for decades now.
Yeah, Germany's approach to defense is deeply rooted in its history, especially the period after World War II. Pacifism, the idea of avoiding war and solving conflicts peacefully, is a core part of their foreign policy, their constitution, even how their military operates.
Interesting.
Their military, the Bundeswehr, is mainly set up for defense.
Yeah.
If they need to take any offensive action, it requires a direct vote from their parliament. It's not a simple decision.
So their constitution actually restricts their ability to engage in offensive military operations.
It does. And on top of that, there's this thing called the debt brake, which was put in place in 2009. It's a rule written right into their constitution that limits how much debt the German government can take on.
It's like a built-in check on their spending.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It forces them to keep their budget more or less balanced. And this makes it really hard to make big investments, especially in things like the military. Because of this debt brake, they haven't consistently met the NATO goal of spending 2% of their gross domestic product, their GDP, on defense.
Okay, so they have these historical and constitutional factors that have really shaped their approach to defense. So where does Merz fit into all of this? How is he looking to change things?
Well, he's put forward this plan. It's a pretty bold plan. It's a 500 billion euro infrastructure fund that would be spread out over the next 10 years. This is a pretty big departure, really, from the CDU's traditional stance. They're typically fiscally conservative, careful with spending. But the most interesting part of Merz's plan is that he wants to exempt defense spending from the debt brake, any spending that goes over 1% of their GDP.
So basically he's saying that money spent on defense shouldn't count towards that debt limit.
Yes, precisely. And this is significant because that exemption could mean Germany's defense spending could jump up to maybe 2.5% to even 3% of their GDP.
Those are levels we haven't seen in a very long time.
No, not since the Cold War.
So what exactly is Merz planning on doing with all of that money? What are his priorities?
He wants to modernize their air and missile defense systems. Part of that would be upgrading their Patriot missile systems, and he's also talking about developing a system that can defend against hypersonic missiles.
Those are the ones that are so fast, they're incredibly difficult to intercept.
Exactly.
That's a big technological challenge.
It is. He's also proposing to make the Bundeswehr bigger, to increase the number of soldiers. He wants to invest in more advanced fighter jets, improve their naval capabilities, and make their cyber warfare defenses much stronger.
This is a pretty extensive plan. And given Germany's history and their debt brake, I have to imagine there are some people who aren't too happy about this.
There have been very mixed reactions. Some are really concerned about the amount of borrowing this would require.
I can see why.
They're worried that it could put Germany's financial stability at risk. But on the other hand, you have people who believe that this shift is absolutely necessary, especially given what's going on in the world right now.
What is it about the current global situation that makes this shift feel so urgent to some people?
Well, the war in Ukraine has been a major turning point. Germany's response to this conflict has already been a pretty big shift from how they've traditionally dealt with these types of situations. They usually avoid direct military involvement, but in this case, they've agreed to provide Ukraine with Leopard 2 tanks.
Those are very powerful battle tanks.
They are, as well as different types of air defense systems and ammunition.
It's a significant contribution.
It is. But Merz argues that they need to do more. He wants to establish a recurring military aid package for Ukraine. He's talking about 3.5 billion euros every year. He's pushing for a long-term commitment to helping them defend themselves.
So he's advocating for a much more proactive approach when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Why does he believe Germany needs to be so involved in this?
He said that containing Russia and preventing them from expanding their military influence is absolutely critical. He wants to avoid more instability in Eastern Europe. He also sees this as a way to make Germany's position in NATO stronger.
To show that they're serious about contributing to the alliance.
Exactly. He wants to demonstrate their commitment to European security, and this is also a way for him to address some of the criticism Germany has received for its past reliance on Russian energy.
Because they were importing so much natural gas from Russia.
Yes, and now he's saying they need to support Ukraine more directly.
So he's taking a very different approach compared to previous German administrations that focus more on diplomatic engagement with Russia.
Yes. Merz is saying that diplomacy is important, but it can only be truly effective if Ukraine is strong enough to defend itself.
That's an interesting point.
He wants to speed up the delivery of weapons, cut through all the bureaucratic red tape, and he's even talked about setting up long-term military agreements with Ukraine to guarantee their security.
What about Ukraine joining NATO? Is that something Merz supports?
He does. He wants Ukraine to be more closely integrated with NATO. He's even suggested it could happen before Ukraine becomes a full member. It's important to understand this is part of a bigger idea he has about defense in Europe.
Okay.
He believes Europe has to take on more responsibility for its own security. He's not saying the U.S. isn't important, but he's arguing that Germany and its European partners can't just depend on the U.S. forever.
That's a significant shift in thinking, considering that the U.S. military presence in Europe has been so intertwined with Germany's defense strategy for decades.
Absolutely. American military bases in Germany have always been a fundamental part of NATO's defense plan. But Merz is saying that this might need to change. He's suggesting that Europe should start moving toward more self-reliance when it comes to defense.
What are the reasons behind this potential shift in thinking? Why is he calling for less reliance on the U.S. now?
There are a few reasons. He's worried about American politics. He thinks they're too unpredictable. And he also believes that the types of security challenges Europe is facing, particularly with Russia, require European solutions.
But they need to figure this out for themselves.
That's what he's saying. And France has also been pushing for a more integrated European defense system, and Merz supports that idea.
So how would this work in practice? Does Merz have any specific ideas about how to increase Europe's self-reliance in defense?
Well, he's proposed a stronger alliance between France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. They'd work together more closely on military projects.
Could you give us an example of that?
Sure. One example is the Future Combat Air System, which is also known as FCAS. France and Germany are already working on this together. He also sees potential for collaborating on nuclear deterrence, especially with all the uncertainty surrounding the U.S.'s long-term commitment to that role.
It sounds like Merz is advocating for a strong European defense structure that works alongside NATO, not to replace it.
Yes, that's exactly right. He's not just saying they need to meet NATO's defense spending goals. He wants to see them develop their own independent strategic capabilities.
What does that mean in practice?
He suggested that Germany increase its own defense spending to more than 2% of its GDP. He thinks NATO's European command structure needs to be stronger so they don't have to rely on the U.S. so much, and he thinks Europe should be able to handle crises on its own, independently.
It's certainly a bold vision for a more autonomous Europe. Has he gotten any pushback on this?
Oh yes, definitely. Some German politicians are very worried that this focus on European independence will actually weaken NATO.
That it might cause divisions within the alliance.
Exactly.
But Merz doesn't think this is about weakening NATO, does he?
No, he thinks it's the opposite. He says a stronger European defense actually makes NATO stronger. But it's a complex debate, lots of different perspectives. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. A lot of people have been talking about Merz's views on the United States' role in Europe.
Yeah, his skepticism about the U.S. sticking to its security commitments over the long term has caused quite a stir. What's driving that skepticism?
Well, he seems to have drawn some conclusions from his observations of the Trump presidency, and there's been this perception of a shift in American foreign policy priorities.
It sounds like he's worried that U.S. administrations might not prioritize European security as much as they have in the past.
Right. He's pointed to political divisions in the U.S. and this increasing focus on the Indo-Pacific region, and he thinks these are factors that could lead to America being less willing to get involved in European defense. And there's also this concern that NATO could become less unified if the U.S. pulls back from collective defense. Merz has cited the ongoing debates about how much NATO members contribute financially and the fact that the U.S. is so focused on China. And he says these are signs that Washington's commitment to European security might be wavering.
Merz's proposal for Germany to consider nuclear deterrence options has been one of his most controversial ideas.
Yeah.
That would be a huge change for Germany, wouldn't it?
It would, especially given their history and their traditional stance on nuclear weapons. But Merz says a credible nuclear deterrent is essential for European security in the current geopolitical climate.
How does he think that should be achieved?
Well, he suggested a few different ways to go about it. One idea is to strengthen the existing nuclear capabilities of France and the UK.
What's been the reaction from France and the UK to that proposal?
It's been a bit mixed. Some defense officials in France have hinted that they're open to exploring deeper nuclear cooperation with Germany.
So they're at least willing to have the conversation.
It seems so. But the British government has been more cautious. They've emphasized that it's important to maintain a unified approach within NATO.
I imagine there are also some serious concerns about the practicalities of a joint nuclear policy. Logistically, strategically, it seems very complicated.
Absolutely. Critics have pointed out that such a policy would face numerous legal and strategic obstacles.
I can imagine.
And this is especially true because of Germany's long-standing opposition to nuclear weapons.
Aside from working with France and the UK on nuclear deterrence, has Merz suggested any other options?
He's also talked about the possibility of Germany participating in a shared European nuclear defense strategy and about increasing investment in missile defense systems.
It seems like even though Merz is pushing for a more independent Europe in terms of defense, he still sees value in the transatlantic alliance.
He does. He believes that a more self-reliant Europe would actually strengthen long-term stability and make the continent less vulnerable to political shifts in Washington.
So he's not advocating for a complete break from the U.S.
No, he's suggesting that Europe should do more to reassure the U.S. of its commitment to NATO.
Like what?
Things like increasing European defense spending and negotiating long-term security agreements that focus on shared strategic objectives.
So he sees Germany playing this kind of bridging role between the U.S. and its European partners.
That's right. He thinks Germany can help make sure they stay aligned on critical security matters. But his call for less reliance on the U.S. hasn't exactly been met with universal praise.
Of course not. It's a pretty big change in direction.
Right. Some policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic have criticized his proposals, saying that they could strain transatlantic relations at a time when European unity is really important. U.S. officials have warned against anything that might undermine collective security.
So there are concerns that this could actually backfire and weaken NATO.
Yeah, some defense analysts in Washington argue that even though it's good for Europe to take on more responsibility for its own security, those efforts should support the existing U.S.-led structures, not replace them.
So what are some of the specific criticisms of a more independent European defense structure?
There's a worry that a European nuclear deterrent could actually provoke Russia rather than deter aggression, and there's skepticism about whether European defense structures are cohesive enough to be effective without strong leadership from the U.S.
Merz's vision is clearly very ambitious, and it seems like putting his defense and infrastructure plan into action would mean navigating a whole web of economic and political obstacles.
It would.
Let's start with the economics. Germany's constitution has that debt brake that we talked about earlier, which really limits how much the government can borrow each year. That seems like a major hurdle for funding these plans.
It is. Critics are saying that exempting defense spending from this rule, as Merz is proposing, could set a dangerous precedent and lead to financial imbalances down the road.
Are there historical examples they're pointing to?
Oh, yes. They often mention Italy's military buildup during the Cold War and France increasing its defense borrowing in the 1980s.
What happened in those cases?
Both countries ended up having to make major economic adjustments to deal with their growing debt.
I see. So besides the debt brake, what are some of the other economic concerns people have raised about Merz's plan?
There are concerns about the potential trade-offs. Germany has a very strong social safety net with things like public health care, pensions, and investments in green energy.
Right.
And if they significantly increase military spending, it might mean coming back on these programs or raising taxes.
Right.
And that could lead to a public backlash.
And then there's the question of how to actually finance these ambitious plans.
Exactly. Merz has talked about using infrastructure bonds, and defense-specific borrowing could become very expensive.
I imagine that's making some economists nervous.
It is. And even within Merz's own party, the CDU, there are members who are worried about the potential economic impact, especially the ones who are fiscally conservative. They're wary of taking on too much debt.
They want to make sure Germany stays financially stable over the long term?
Exactly. They believe that should be a higher priority than increasing defense spending right now. It's not just the economics. Merz is also facing some political headwinds, especially from other parties in Germany. He's got some support from within the CDU, of course, and some members of the Free Democratic Party, or FDP, also think it's a good idea to increase military spending. But a lot of people are against it.
Which parties are the most resistant to his plans?
Well, the SPD is worried that if they prioritize the military, it'll hurt Germany's progress on things like climate initiatives and social programs.
And what about the Green Party? Where do they stand on this?
The Greens have historically been skeptical of military expansion, so this has really divided the party. Some of them say, okay, maybe a stronger European defense is necessary in the world today. But others are really worried that this means Germany is shifting to a more militaristic foreign policy.
What about the alternative for Germany, the AfD?
They're a bit of a mixed bag. They're a far-right party, and they support the idea of European autonomy, but they've been critical of aid to Ukraine, and they're not really committed to NATO.
So it seems like getting everyone on board with increasing defense spending is going to be really difficult, especially given all these different viewpoints.
Yeah, it would be a huge challenge to build a broad coalition that supports Marx's proposals. And then you have to consider public opinion in Germany.
I was just going to ask about that. Historically, Germans have been hesitant about large-scale military spending. Why is that?
Well, it goes back to their experiences with militarism in the past and the fact that pacifism became so important after World War II. Polls show that most Germans still prefer to use diplomacy and economic tools to resolve conflicts rather than taking a more assertive military approach.
Are there any regional differences in how people feel about this?
Yes, there are. People in the former East Germany tend to be more skeptical about expanding the military.
Why is that?
It's partly because of the strong anti-militarist sentiment that has persisted in that region since the Cold War. And there are also economic concerns. In more conservative areas like Bavaria, people are generally more supportive of increasing defense spending.
So people's views on defense are still shaped by history and also by where they live.
That's right. And there's also a generational divide. Younger Germans, especially those who live in cities, are more likely to oppose increased military spending. Older generations tend to see it as more necessary given the current geopolitical situation.
So it's not just where they live, but also when they were born that influences how they see these issues.
Exactly. And of course, people's political affiliations also play a role. People who support the CDU or the CSU and the FDP generally favor increasing defense spending, while Green Party and SPD supporters are mostly against it. The AfD is a bit more complicated. Their supporters like the idea of European autonomy, but they're not so keen on closer military ties with NATO.
It's interesting to see how people's attitudes on defense are connected to Germany's history and the current political landscape.
It is. It's a really interesting mix of factors. But even if public opinion did shift, Merz would still have to overcome some legal and institutional hurdles to make his vision a reality.
What are some of the obstacles he might face?
Well, if they want to make big changes to Germany's defense strategy, they'd probably need to change some laws, especially when it comes to sending troops outside of the existing NATO framework.
Right, that would be a major step.
And for Merz to get his proposed reform to the debt brake approved, he'd need a lot of support from the Bundestag. And getting that kind of consensus is going to be really tough.
Are there any other institutional challenges he might run into?
Germany's procurement process, which is how they buy military equipment and supplies, has always been notoriously slow and inefficient.
I've heard that.
It's really hindered their efforts to modernize the military in the past. So even if they increase funding, there's no guarantee that it will actually lead to improvements. Now, it's also important to think about how Merz's vision is being received by Germany's European allies. How are countries like France and the UK responding to his proposals?
That's a good question. Let's start with France. They're Germany's closest partner in both military and economic matters. How have they reacted to Merz's call for increased European autonomy in defense?
Well, France has been pretty cautious, but their response has generally been positive.
So they're on board with the idea of Germany taking a more assertive role in defense.
President Emmanuel Macron has been pushing for a stronger European defense initiative for a while now, so he sees Germany's shift as a positive thing. But there is some concern within France.
What are they worried about?
mainly about how this might affect the existing leadership dynamics within Europe.
That makes sense. France has traditionally been seen as the leading military power in Europe,
Mm,
especially because they have nuclear weapons. I can see why they might be a little wary of any changes to that dynamic.
exactly. Some French officials are worried that if Germany's military gets stronger, it could upset the balance of power. The Future Combat Air System, or FCAS, is a good example. France and Germany have had some disagreements over funding and leadership for that project.
It just goes to show that even close allies can have different priorities, and that can lead to friction. What about nuclear deterrence? Has France been open to Merz's ideas about collaborating on that?
They've been willing to talk about it, but they're not keen on extending their nuclear umbrella to Germany. They don't want to do anything that could destabilize the strategic balance in Europe.
What about the UK? How are they viewing Merz's proposals?
Well, the UK is still a very important security ally for Germany and Europe, even though they've left the EU. Their response to Merz's ideas has been a mix of support and caution.
So they like the idea of greater European self-reliance in principle, but they have some reservations.
That's a good way to put it. British defense officials have said they welcome the idea of Europe contributing more to security. They think it would benefit NATO as a whole, but they're very clear that any moves towards European autonomy should work within the NATO framework, not replace it.
And have they shown any interest in Merz's proposal for nuclear collaboration?
They've been more hesitant than France on that issue. They prefer to stick with the existing NATO structure and its reliance on the US-led nuclear deterrent.
It seems like the countries on NATO's eastern flank, the ones closest to Russia, have a very different perspective on all of this.
They do. Countries like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have been very vocal in their support for Merz's proposals.
Why is that?
Well, they've been critical of Germany in the past. They thought Germany was too slow to respond to Russia's actions, particularly when it came to providing military aid to Ukraine.
They felt like Germany wasn't taking the threat seriously enough.
That's right. So they see Merz's push for increased defense spending as a sign that Germany is finally waking up to the reality of the security situation in Europe.
So they're looking for more than just words from Germany.
Definitely. They want to see action. Poland, for example, has already set its own defense spending target at 4% of its GDP, which is way higher than NATO's 2% requirement. They want Germany to follow suit.
Can match their level of commitment.
Exactly. And they also want to see deeper cooperation with Germany on things like joint military exercises, defense logistics, and coordinating air defense.
They really see a stronger Germany as essential for their own security. What about the responses from other parts of Europe, like Southern and Western European countries?
It's been more mixed there, which reflects the broader disagreements within Europe about military expansion. Some countries, like Italy and Spain, recognize that they need to coordinate more on defense, but they have their own economic problems that make it hard to increase their military spending. Others, like the Netherlands, have been more supportive of Merz's vision and his push for a stronger European pillar within NATO.
So there's a real debate going on within Europe about whether to prioritize military spending or focus on economic resilience and diplomatic solutions.
There is, and these different perspectives are also reflected in the reactions from NATO and the United States.
So while NATO as an institution has been pleased to see Germany commit to higher defense spending, Merz's emphasis on European autonomy has created some unease in both Washington and Brussels.
That's right. The U.S. in particular is worried about potential fragmentation in Europe. American officials have stressed that any European military initiatives should align with NATO's goals so they don't end up undermining the unity of the transatlantic alliance. When it comes to nuclear deterrence, the Pentagon is less enthusiastic about shifting responsibilities away from the existing transatlantic framework.
They're not keen on giving up control.
Historically, they've preferred to manage nuclear deterrence themselves rather than relying on regional European solutions. It's a complex situation.
It is. As we've discussed, Merz's vision for German defense policy is very ambitious, and it faces some significant challenges. There are fiscal constraints, differing opinions among European allies, domestic political opposition, and concerns from the United States. It's not clear whether his vision will actually become reality.
It's hard to say at this point, but one thing's for sure. He's started a very important conversation about the future of European security and Germany's place in the world.
As a conversation with global implications, if Merz's vision does come to pass, it could have a huge impact on Germany's role on the world stage, the future of NATO, and transatlantic relations as we know them. It really makes you think about what a more autonomous Europe would look like. and how it would handle the complexities of global security in the 21st century.
It's a crucial time for these discussions. The decisions that are made in the next few years will have a big impact on the global landscape.
It's something we'll definitely continue to follow closely. And for our listeners, we encourage you to think about these evolving dynamics and what a changing global security environment means for you.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.